Salem Witch Trials. Why the Salem hysteria began. Whenever October rolls around, we get absolutely bombarded with all this spooky folklore. But today, let's strip away the myths, right? Let's dive right into this explainer and uncover the very human, grounded reasons why this tragedy actually happened. Let's start with this massive number, 200. Between early 1692 and mid-1693, over 200 people in colonial Massachusetts were accused of practicing the devil's magic. Just imagine that for a second. In a relatively small colonial settlement, hundreds of neighbors, friends, and even family members were suddenly pointing fingers at one another. They were totally convinced that a dark, supernatural conspiracy was living right next door.
And tragically, 20 of those individuals were executed. It's heartbreaking, really, and it leaves us with this centuries-old mystery that historians have debated ever since. How exactly did a tight-knit, deeply religious community turn on itself so violently? Well, to figure that out, we've got to look past the supernatural and examine the very real, earthly tensions that were brewing at the time.
Part 1. Brewing a Perfect Storm. The Socio-Political Triggers of 1689. To really understand the scale of this tragedy, we have to look at the immense pressures cooking under the surface just a few years prior. The hysteria didn't start with magic, you see. It started with the very real trauma of war. Back in 1689, King William's War was raging, ravaging the colonies. And this created a massive refugee crisis. It sent waves of displaced people right into Essex County, which placed a severe strain on Salem Village's already limited resources. Now, combine that with the arrival of their minister, Reverend Samuel Parris, who quickly earned a reputation for being rigid and, honestly, pretty greedy, and you've got a community completely on edge.
In fact, the community was literally split in two by a bitter socio-economic rivalry. On one side, you had families tied to the thriving, wealthy port of Salem Town. On the flip side, you had families out in Salem Village who were strictly dependent on agriculture. They were really struggling to get by, especially with that sudden influx of refugees we just talked about. This massive disparity in wealth and lifestyle created deep, simmering resentments.
So here's the crucial point. In this deeply religious, Puritan environment, these mundane economic and social tensions weren't just seen as normal political friction. They were interpreted as a literal, supernatural attack. When neighbors fought over property lines, or, say, church politics, they honestly believed the devil was actively at work trying to tear their godly community apart.
Part 2. The Spark and the Spread. Fits, accusations, and the first targets.
With the community acting as a literal powder keg, all it took was a single spark in January 1692 to set the whole town ablaze. It started when local girls began having these unexplainable fits. When a doctor blamed the supernatural, the magistrates pressured the girls to point fingers. And guess what? The very first accusations landed on the most marginalized, vulnerable women in the village: Tituba, an enslaved Caribbean woman; Sarah Good, a homeless beggar; and Sarah Osborne, an impoverished elderly woman. They were the absolute perfect scapegoats.
Now, while the other two women deny the charges, Tituba made a choice that changed everything. She confessed. "The devil came to me and bid me serve him." And she didn't just confess, she offered a chilling, elaborate tale. She testified about black dogs and a tall man who made her sign a book. This elaborate confession poured gasoline on the paranoia. It gave the magistrates exactly what they feared the most: confirmation of a wider, organized conspiracy against the Puritans.
The panic truly spiraled out of control when upstanding citizens became targets. When Martha Corey, a loyal and respected church member, was accused, the community realized that if she could be a witch, literally anyone could be. I mean, the hysteria became so utterly blind that magistrates even construed the timid, confused answers of a 4-year-old girl as a legitimate confession of witchcraft. The 4-year-old. No way, right?
Part 3. The Court and the Condemned. The Deadly Consequences of Spectral Evidence.
This is where a local panic transforms into state-sanctioned executions. In May 1692, the governor established a special court, and the deadliest decision this court made was allowing what was known as spectral evidence. Basically, this was testimony about dreams and visions used by the court as legal proof of witchcraft. An accuser could literally say, "Hey, your spirit visited me in my sleep and bit me," and the court accepted it as hard proof. Imagine trying to defend yourself against something someone claims you did in their dream. It was a completely impossible standard.
Looking at the timeline, the speed of the hysteria was absolutely terrifying. It escalated rapidly from a few girls having strange fits in January to the first 3 women being accused in February, and then a special court being ordered in May. By June,
Bridget Bishop becomes the first person hanged. It became a relentless machine running straight through the summer until the court was finally dissolved in October.
The human cost of this breakdown in societal order was just staggering. 19 people were hanged on Gallows Hill. At least 5 died in jail. And then there is the horrific fate of 71-year-old Giles Corey, who was literally pressed to death with heavy stones. The paranoia was so absolute, so incredibly widespread, that colonists even killed 2 dogs, believing the innocent animals were linked to the devil. Fortunately, voices of reason finally began to break through the madness. Listen to this quote: "It were better that 10 suspected witches should escape than 1 innocent person be condemned." That powerful statement comes from Increase Mather, the president of Harvard at the time. He boldly denounced the court's use of spectral evidence. This moral clarity, demanding that the burden of proof shouldn't cost innocent lives, was a massive turning point that really helped turn the tide.
Part 4. Reclaiming the Narrative. Centuries of Apologies and Modern Reflections.
The momentum finally stopped when the governor's own wife was questioned as a suspected witch. Suddenly, further arrests were prohibited, but it took centuries to truly undo the damage. The long road to justice spanned over 300 years. Step 1. In 1702, the trials are officially declared unlawful. Step 2. In 1711, the colony grants restitution to the heirs. Step 3. Fast forward all the way to 1957 for Massachusetts to issue a formal apology. And Step 4. Remarkably, in 2022, Elizabeth Johnson Jr. becomes the last exonerated victim. A class of 8th grade civics students successfully lobbied the state to clear her name. Middle schoolers, finally closing this dark chapter of history. Amazing.
Over the years, people have desperately tried to make sense of this whole thing. Early scientists looked for medical causes, giving us the French theory of ergotism, which blames fungus-contaminated food for the hallucinations. But modern historians widely agree this was a tragedy born of its socio-political environment, the extreme community tension we talked about earlier. It's a psychological phenomenon famously explored in Arthur Miller's play, The Crucible, using Salem as a brilliant allegory for anti-communist McCarthyism.
Which brings us to a rather chilling thought. The Salem trials ended in 1693, but what modern fears are brewing our next witch hunt? As we wrap up this explainer, we have to look in the mirror and ask ourselves, if Salem was never really about magic, but rather about xenophobia, wealth disparity, and social tension bubbling over into mass paranoia, where else in our modern world is this exact same perfect storm brewing today? Keep your eyes open, because human nature hasn't changed all that much since 1692. Thanks for exploring this with me.